I'm a research scholar at IASA and involved in the NaturaConnect project, which is organizing this webinar on mapping the future of Europe's protected areas. I'm here today joined by my colleagues Piero Visconti, Louise O'Connor, and Jutta Bayer, and also others from our consortium, as well as you. In today's webinar, you will hear a little bit about our mapping approaches and how we're mapping where protected areas can be expanded and how, and what the methods underlying them are. As a general housekeeping information, as a start, this is a webinar. This presentation is being recorded, so just for your information. But of course, it's completely anonymous, and if you don't want to make yourself known in that sense, we're also willing to respect that. You can write your questions and comments in the chat, indicating the speaker you want to address. And all the presentations, this presentation and the recordings afterwards will be available at our website, naturaconnect.eu afterwards. And you can also very much feel free to rename yourself and also state your organization, for instance, by right-clicking on your profile picture here and rename it to your name. That always helps when we address comments from the audience. And of course, please stop your camera when you address questions. For the agenda today, first off, we will kickstart by Dr. Piero Visconti from IASA, who is the scientific coordinator, and will introduce the project for all. Afterwards, we will tell you a little bit about how we are mapping priority areas for the 30% and the 10% protection targets of the European Union, which will be led by my colleague Louise O'Connor. Following this, we will have an intermediate Q&A session and then go on to introducing our priority checker tool, which essentially is a tool that allows you to directly leave feedback on the maps that we produced. So also to see, okay, where you might agree or not, or what other concerns you might have. And we will do this a little bit by breakout groups, but if in case you don't want in the breakout groups, or basically there's some other concerns, there's also opportunity to do it on your own pace later on. So don't be concerned with not being able to give all the feedback you want during this meeting or later. Okay, with this, I will pass over to my colleague Piero Visconti to give you a little bit introduction of what NaturaConnect aims to do.
Thank you, Martin, for the introduction, and thank you also for the support in organizing this to all my colleagues at IASA, Europark Federation, and WWF. So NaturaConnect is a Horizon Europe project, a research and innovation action project whose main goal is to provide knowledge, tools, and capacity building to support EU member states and neighboring countries in realizing a resilient, ecologically representative and well-connected network of protected areas and ecological corridors that support them. We are a consortium of 22 organizations, many of which are research organizations, but we also have several policy and conservation organizations, including national agencies. Next slide, please. The overarching goal of NaturaConnect is supported by a series of specific objectives, some of which will require your support and feedback to be realized. The first one is to define a blueprint for what is a trans-European nature network of existing protected areas, future proposed designations, as well as ecological corridors. A blueprint means essentially providing data knowledge and tools and maps to identify priority areas, and also provide capacity building to member states to identify the national priorities. Because the NN is meant to be resilient to existing land use and climate change, and we're also developing future scenarios that allow us to have some foresight on what would happen within and outside protected areas to ensure resilience. And as a third objective, instead, we also identify means to implement and in terms of what are the best practices for implementation, as well as the financial instruments that can be used, both private, public, and blended financial instruments to support connectivity conservation as well as management of protected areas. Our fourth objective instead is to advanced data collection methods to monitor the performance of protected areas. For instance, through surveys inside and outside the protected areas to measure the effectiveness. And for this, we have a specific task that look at how could an ideal monitoring scheme look like to review and improve the performance of protected areas. And finally, our last objective that is also very relevant for today is to engage with stakeholders and policymakers to get their feedback from national and local experts on what are the challenges they are facing for planning and implementing TNN and how can our project support. If we move to the next slide, this is the background against which we are working. We already in the EU, but also generally in Europe, we already have quite a lot of land that is dedicated to conservation. Our project is exclusively terrestrial, but you see there is also quite a lot of marine systems that are protected. Depending on what we measure as the baseline level, we are looking at within the EU specifically either 18% of land area or 26% of land areas being our baseline, that's actually 30%. But we see that despite a large effort, we still have some gaps in coverage, which are apparent in the next slides, where we have essentially, if you look at these histograms, on the y-axis, we have the number of species, and on the x-axis, the percentage of range covered by Natura 2000 sites. And if we click one more, we see that the distribution improves somewhat when you account for all designations, including national designations that don't overlap with the Natura 2000 sites. But we still have about 350 globally threatened species which have less than 20% of the range protected. So this is to say that despite the enormous effort, we still have important gaps in coverage for threatened species, and the same could be said about habitat types within the EU and also in neighboring countries. That is why in the next slide, we see the ambitious targets that the EU has adopted, but also other countries that are signatory of the CBD have adopted to legally protect at least 30% of land and of the sea. Within Europe, we have also specific targets, target 2, which mandates to have at least 1/3 of this area to be strictly protected. In order to address those gaps in coverage that I've highlighted before, the Commission has issued a guidance document that highlights some priorities, which are for the EU in particular to complete the Natura 2000 network following the Annex 3 of the Habitat Directive, which means take a specific look at the habitat and species in the Annex of the Birds and Habitat Directive that require designation. But also the Commission has realized that national designations can support Natura 2000 sites, for instance, by enhancing connectivity and providing buffer areas that reduce disturbance. And they also recognize that the Habitat Directive is not sufficient alone to identify priority habitat species, and recommend also to consider red listing approaches. So despite we have these priorities, we still are lacking some specific guidance for actually how to map these priority areas. And this is one of the key goals of the project. And if we move to the next slide, with this, we show why a pan-European approach can be very important. Of course, implementation of the various directives and target 3 of the CBD is national, but biodiversity knows no border. And in these 2 examples, you can see, for example, 2 species, one which is endemic of France, a nuthatch, the Corsican nuthatch, and then a bat species that instead has only a small portion of its range in France. So while from a national perspective, rarity that is at the edge of its range might be interesting and important, from a range-wide perspective and from a global perspective, we need to put emphasis on species at the national level for which a given country has a disproportionate responsibility. And these can only be achieved if we consider the entire range of a species and if we have a bird-eye view that looks at pan-European priorities to support national planning exercises. Another reason why we need to look at pan-European priorities is connectivity. This is a map that our colleague Jeremy Dattin at IDIV in Leipzig has been producing, which look at functional connectivity for large carnivores. With the next click, you can look at a zoom in of this priority for connectivity next, which show that some of these corridors actually cross geographic boundaries. And some of these would require broader countryside connectivity conservation measures, and some would require actions within protected areas, including new designations. And this is only possible if we have a pan-European perspective, which looks at connectivity and biogeographical aspects beyond any single country. And with the next slide, I basically conclude by saying that for the remainder of this webinar, we will show, my colleague Liz O'Connor will show what is the methodology that we have adopted to identify priority areas at the pan-European scale, and we show some preliminary results. And what we really want to have today is some general feedback on the methods, data, and objectives that we are using. And also Martin Jung later on will showcase a tool that allows any user to provide specific feedback on these maps. The intention is to later on take stock of all the feedback that we'll see today and in the coming 2 weeks and revise our outputs to then check in again with you and anyone else that is interested in a later webinar towards the end of the year. And with this, I hand over to my colleague Louise O'Connor.
Thank you, Piero. Hi, everyone. I'm Louise, and I'll now dive into the methods for identifying European conservation priorities. Next. As Piero already mentioned, protected areas currently cover about 26% of Europe, and that includes 18% that are Natura 2000 sites and 3% of area that is protected as IUCN categories 1 and 2. So to reach the 30% target, we basically only have 4% of land area that's available. So we need to choose these new sites wisely so that they deliver the highest benefits for biodiversity. And within the 30%, we also need to identify the top 10% of area that would benefit for stronger levels of protection. And meeting these targets is going to be particularly challenging given that land is so constrained in Europe, and we really only have a small amount of area and resources available for conservation. So we need to make those new areas matter to halt and ultimately reverse biodiversity decline. Next. Spatial conservation prioritization is a well-established method for selecting the best locations to protect. It's a tool to identify priority areas that maximize the amount of biodiversity protected within limited resources, where resources could be area, for example, 5% or 10% of land. And spatial conservation prioritization optimizes the protection of every single species and habitat throughout their geographical distribution and finds top priority areas that are irreplaceable and complementary to each other and to existing protected areas. And so we can see how spatial conservation prioritization works with a simple example with 4 sites and 4 species illustrated here. And we want to know which sites should be protected in priority. And if we could only protect one site, we would choose site C because it contains the endemic frog and another species. So site C has the highest biodiversity value among the 4 sites. And if we could protect 2 sites, we would also protect site B because it contains the endemic snake. And so if we lost this site, we might lose the snake forever. So this is also just to illustrate that it's not just a question of identifying the sites with the greatest species richness, but rather we want to identify a set of irreplaceable sites that together complement each other and benefit a maximum number of species throughout their geographical distribution. Next. And in the project, we're considering all species and habitats that are listed in the Nature Directive, so Birds and Habitats Directive, as well as those that are known to be threatened in the IUCN Red List, of species and ecosystems. And we're also considering all remaining primary and old growth forests, which we know need to be placed under strict protection, as well as carbon-rich ecosystems like raised bogs, peat bogs, that store and sequester carbon and that need to be protected to continue to function as carbon sinks. And we also account for the conservation status of species and habitats by upweighting those that are known to be threatened or in unfavorable conservation status, because they need to be protected perhaps more urgently than others. Next. In the project, we have a whole work package that's dedicated to generating high-resolution maps of where species live across Europe, and they use species distribution models, also known as SDMs. And these SDM basically combine known presences of species and the environmental conditions where the species are known to occur to predict where else a species could live, even in places where no one has sampled or monitored. And the output of these SDM are high-resolution maps at a 1 kilometer resolution of where species are across Europe, and those fill gaps in sampling and monitoring coverage. They combine multiple data sources, and we can also predict the distributions in future climate, which is really quite essential to make our conservation priorities resilient to climate changes. Next. And we then use this data to identify priorities for conservation across Europe. And we consider existing protected areas. Of course, we don't start from scratch, so that our priorities are complementary to existing protected areas and also fill the gaps in coverage for under-protected species and habitats. And we also implement this notion of burden sharing of conservation efforts so that the new protected areas to reach the 30% and 10% targets would be evenly distributed and balanced between European countries. And I'll show some first example maps of top priorities for 3 different scenarios. In a first scenario, we'll see priorities that reach 30% of protected areas at the European level with no limit on the surface area to be protected per country. So that's without burden sharing. And that scenario might be relevant for countries that are already beyond 30% of protected area coverage nationally and that are willing to do more. In a second scenario, we'll see the priorities to reach 30% at the European level again, but this time with burden sharing of the 30% per country, so that each country gets 30%. And then I'll show an example scenario for the top 10% based on the ecological value across all species and habitats that we consider. Next, please. So this is the output map, the first scenario where we identify top priorities across all of Europe to reach 30% without burden sharing. And priorities are in pink on the map. And so these areas are irreplaceable at the European level and complementary to each other and to existing protected areas. Protected areas are in grey. And so they optimize for over 1,000 species and habitats, but I just want to give you a few examples of species that would particularly benefit from protecting these priority areas. Next, please. So, for example, here we have in the west of the Pyrenees, Soldanella, which is a plant that's endemic to the Western Pyrenees. We also have the Pyrenean desman, a few vultures, and other species that are generally endemic to the Iberian Peninsula in southwest France. In Doñana, in the south of Spain, we have very unique species at the European level that live in the south of Spain, like the Iberian lynx, the marble duck. Next. Another example is in the Alps, where we have lots of areas that are selected for species that are endemic to the Alps. For example, the alpine bumblebee, certain crickets, the alpine ibex, and also a lot of plants. Next. And another last example is this area in Romania, which is home to the blind mole rat, which only lives there, as well as to other species that are unique at the European level, like the eastern imperial eagle. And just wanted to note that this specific site in Romania illustrates, again, that it's not just about species richness, because this site only, quote unquote, has 50 species, but some of them are only found there, and they are insufficiently protected, which is why this area gets selected as a priority. Next, please. And to assess the overall conservation gains in these priority areas, we can take a look at this bar plot on the right-hand side, which quantifies the amount of distributions that would be gained in the priorities in pink compared to the current protection levels in grey for habitats and species. And this bar plot is telling us that in just 4% of European land, we can significantly improve the protection levels of species and habitats. For habitats, for example, we could go from 30% of habitats distributions currently protected on average to 54%. And for species, we could go from 30% that are currently protected on average to 41% of distributions protected on average, with the additional 4% of land. Next. However, you may have noticed that in this map, the priorities are unevenly distributed across Europe. For example, Greece, Spain, Croatia would have more than 30% of their area in this map because they already are sort of very close or beyond the 30% and still have lots of unique species and ecosystems at the European level. So without burden sharing, the priorities are purely based on biogeography, which is interesting, but perhaps not so relevant for policy implementation. And in our project, we aim for our work to be as policy relevant as possible. So we created another scenario that balances conservation efforts between countries in Europe. And so next, please. This is a second scenario where the 30% are achieved in each country. The priorities shift a little bit. Oh, sorry, this is too soon. Yeah, thank you. Sorry. So this is a scenario where the 30% are achieved in each country and the priorities shift a bit. So for example, in Greece or Bulgaria, we're already beyond 30%, so no new areas can be added. And meanwhile, we see that in Sweden, for example, we have more priority areas selected than other countries, simply because currently Sweden only has about 15% of protected area coverage and still would need an additional 15% of land to reach 30%. And the biodiversity gains in this scenario are still quite high, so we're still delivering quite high biodiversity benefits in just 4% of European land. Next, please. So yeah, now moving on to priorities for the 10% target. Here we ask, basically within the 30%, what would be the top third of areas to protect? And there are many different approaches and visions to strict protection. So what I'll show now is really just one of the many ways to approach the 10%. And so next. The first question is, of course, what can we consider to be currently under strict protection? Here we consider the IUCN categories 1 and 2 as strictly protected, and we use this as a baseline for expansion to reach 10%. And just to point out that we are aware that IUCN categories are not perfect, but we have to use this in absence of better data on existing protected areas in Europe, at least for the moment. And then the next criteria is that the 10% are including with the 30%. So it includes upgrading of non-strict protected areas, and we try to implement a core and buffer spatial structure when possible. Next. The third criteria is that among the 30%, the 10% would be the areas with the highest biodiversity value for all species and habitats, as well as for carbon-rich ecosystems like peatlands, old-growth forests that need non-disturbance to function as carbon sinks. And finally, we also assume in this specific map that extractive activities are limited in the 10%, and so we don't prioritize for a number of habitats that are known to be fully dependent on continued agricultural activities. And with those criteria, this is what the map looks like with the top 10% in blue. And this is a preliminary map, and this is, again, one of many approaches to strict protection. And in the next slide, I just want to briefly mention that we're currently exploring different options and variants for strict protection in future analyses, because, of course, other criteria are also equally important, like, for example, a focus specifically on sensitive species that are sensitive to human disturbance, where we would use data on pressures from the Article 17 or the IUCN threats data. We can also develop a variant that is focused on sustaining ecological integrity in natural processes like dispersal migration, species interactions, evolutionary adaptation. We could also think of a variant that minimizes socio-economic opportunity costs. But in the meantime, today, we just show a map for priorities for the 10% that is purely based on the biogeography of species and habitats. And we'd be already quite interested to hear what you think about it. Next, please. So in the map on the online tool, you will see a distinction between existing protected areas in grey. In blue are also protected areas, but they are identified as priorities as part of the 10%, and that have a high ecological value just based on the distributions of all species and habitats. And the third category you will see in the map are the protected area expansion priorities. So those are the additional sites that would reach the target for 30% protected area coverage in Europe and within member states, countries. Next slide, please. So yes, just to say that the maps we're showing today are quite preliminary because they are purely focused on the present day distributions of species and habitats. And so that's just one of the elements that we will ultimately consider when designing priorities for conservation. So in the next few months, we'll develop, or we are currently actually working on developing scenarios that ensure a connected and resilient protected area network, where we consider the future range shifts of species in future climates, as well as ecosystem services, climate change, connectivity, land use change scenarios, socioeconomic costs. And so, of course, we'll be happy to share these results, or even maybe have another webinar later this year to explore the maps that include these different elements, because for sure they will shift a little bit once we include climate change and connectivity, for example. And also, we can still adapt the methods and the approach based on your feedback, or any feedback you might have today or later. So yeah, and with that, I will end, and I will pass back to Martin, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Louise. This was a very comprehensive overview of our first preliminary analysis results. And again, this is all work in process. We are actively refining many of this methodology, also the underlying data. And this is also why your feedback of those of you who are here today are so helpful to also show us a bit like, are we on the right track? Where are like obvious mistakes or errors or things that you might want to see further improved? And with this, I now invite some general feedback on the content presented so far. This is mostly on the overall message, methods and preliminary results that Louise presented. I see already there's plenty of activities in the chat. Maybe we can take those in order. Marit, can you?
Yeah, there's already a few questions in the chat. Some have been answered on the strict protection criteria already, so that has been covered, I think. So I would just jump to the methodology questions. The first one is, which HSM method did you choose? Did you try to use zonation software for this task, or did you use only Prioritize R?
Yes, I can take this. We use Prioritize R, and this is because of a few things. The first is zonation. This is technical, I apologize, but zonation would need hierarchical data for protected areas, and so it doesn't deal very well with continuous data on protected areas, and protected areas in Europe are often quite small and cover a small fraction of 1 kilometer grid cells, whereas Prioritize R actually deals with this continuous coverage within a grid cell. So that's one advantage. And the other reason is for this notion of burden sharing, which Prioritize R we can really like deal with that in a specific way, whereas it's not the case in zonation. Yes. I don't know, Martin or Piero, if you want to complement this.
No, this is excellent. I mean, and just to highlight, of course, there are many other complementarity-based algorithms. Zonation is a good example and so forth. In our case, of course, we're really building also a bit on these concepts. Okay, how can we align different member states' priorities, make sure that burden sharing is, for instance, implemented and so far. And these get, of course, a bit more tricky to implement in comparable software. But yeah, it's one approach. There are many others, of course.
Okay, there's another question on the methods regarding the weights. Why are the weights for critical endangered and endangered species habitats so low compared to least endangered, data deficient, and other species and habitats? This must have been discussed with Heini from Work Package 7 in our project. But what was the difference so small in the results that it did not eventually matter what you used? So yeah, regarding the weights.
Louise, do you want to take
Yes,
this one?
I can
Yeah,
take
okay.
this.
Okay.
We did have a higher weight for critically endangered. So basically, critically endangered species and habitats are 5 times more important than least concerned species. Endangered are 4 times more important. So we have sort of a higher weight the higher we go up in this threat status. And of course, if we had varied the weights, this would likely have impacted the priority selection. But we think that this is the sort of the best one to balance, you know, the range size of species, their conservation needs, as well as their threat status. But we're open to testing other variations if you have suggestions. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, I also would like to add, of course, that things like weights, for instance, is one critical way, of course, how we can incorporate some feedback to eventually increase the priority for certain species. And of course, also pinning to the work together with Heini Koyala, who is also in NaturaConnect and working at a Finnish case study. We, of course, in very active discussions with her about this as well.
Okay, I go on with the questions. How is expansion of protected areas versus connecting protected areas prioritized, giving limited area that can be allocated?
Luis, should I?
Yeah, I can take this. Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes, great question. And this is something that we're actively thinking about in our project. And we're actually going to do 2 different variations of this. So the first one will really focus on protecting the habitat patches within the 30%. And then thinking that connectivity can be sort of managed more sustainably outside of the 30%. That's just one approach. And then the other variation that we will do is to actually try and select the 30% expansion also along the connectivity corridor so that we have both habitat patches and the corridors and stepping stones that are protected to aid the movement and to make sure that those corridors aren't disrupted. So we're really going to be doing the 2, and we'll be analyzing what are the trade-offs in both approaches.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and there's still more question, which is great. I just keep on because we still have some time, I guess. So regarding climate change, when you look at climate change scenario impacts, it would be interesting to see how stable networks are. Are tipping points reached where new network designs look more likely to deliver better outcomes?
Mm-hmm. I can take maybe this one, so just East doesn't need to respond all the time. Yeah, this is very certainly interesting and very also keen on our mind. We are looking in future scenarios, not only on climate resilience of the network, so future climate scenarios, but also, for instance, in interaction with land use change, which is also, of course, something that might change in the future and how that will also affect the connectings of the network. In the project itself, we have not yet incorporated these data, but as I will also raise at the end of the webinar, we're planning a new also follow-up presentation and webinar after this one, where you might see some of these results afterwards. But we are actively working on including that. And this, of course, is a key criteria since it will affect, for instance, species movements across the landscape and certain areas that might become unsuitable for species to persist in meaningful numbers. So it's definitely something we need and should take into account.
Okay, then there are 2 questions about Switzerland, which I just put together. One is about the data. If I saw correctly, the produced maps include the territory of Switzerland. What are the data sources used for Switzerland? Species, existing protected areas, etc. And then related to that, on slide 20, the entire Swiss Alps are marked as priority for area expansion, 30% with burden sharing. Would you have more detailed information on this? It would be highly interesting for the Swiss debate on ecological infrastructure. So on the data and more details on the Alpine area.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer this. So in terms of the data sources, this works as well for outside of Switzerland, but of course for Switzerland as well. So for existing protected areas, we simply took the World Database on Protected Areas. So this distinguishes also all protected area categories, as well as the more strict, which we consider to be IUCN 1 and 2 categories, management categories. And in terms of the species distributions and presence data, we used GBIF for all species, so the Global Facility on Biodiversity Information, something like this. For insects, we also have Safeguard, the EDAFO base database, and for plants, we also have specifically the European Vegetation Archive database, which is a standardized sampling monitoring scheme across Europe for plants, and as well as a number of other databases more specific to different groups of taxa, and then UNIS for habitats, yeah. Correct. And then the IUCN ranges, which are the extent of occurrences of species, were also used to refine a little bit the species distribution model outputs. I hope that answers the question. And then in terms of the patterns for Switzerland, I can take a closer look, and indeed the Swiss Alps were definitely shown as top priorities for the 30%, at least at the level of Switzerland and Europe. And this, I think, is because there are so many endemic species that are really native to the Alps. The whole, alpine arc is selected in general. So yeah, that would be a reason why. But I'm happy to share, zoomed in details, and we can look into it later in the breakout groups as well.
Yeah.
Thanks for the questions. Yeah.
I would also quickly add to that. So NaturaConnect, besides these expansion priority maps, produces a range of new data sources on species distribution services and so forth. All of this data will be publicly and openly available, and this is the data that we're using. So much of the data is also integrated, best available data across Europe that we're using for pan-European data, which you are welcome to interrogate later as well.
Okay, there's still a few more questions. Also related to data, was there a way in which you were able to deal with spatial survey bias of species data?
Yeah, I can quickly respond to that since it's a bit connected to the previous question. The species distribution data, they were carefully corrected, and also for survey data, for existing range maps, for accessibility and so forth. This is work led by our colleague Wilfried Thurier in Grenoble in this team. And the data, some of these data are already openly available, so you can also take a look at them. And they, of course, also in active development and trying still to fix a few issues with them. But of course, some of this can also help us today in the exercise that we're doing here to further improve of these data, because they will, of course, also determine some of the results we see.
Yeah, if I can just add to that, I think as well, so in the case of plants, because we use the European Vegetation Archive, which is really standardized, this is a great way to not have these sort of sampling biases. But in general, for other species, they also corrected for bias, so survey bias, also with targeted pseudo absences, or like these specific methods that are in SDMs that are really meant to address and tackle this bias issue. Yeah, thanks for the question.
Okay, the next one is about land ownership, I guess. Have you also factored in the issue of willingness of people to give their land for conservation purposes? It might be much easier to put in 10 hectare of priority 2 areas than fighting for 1 hectare of priority 1 in another place.
I can take that one, understand, I guess. Yeah, I mean, generally, yeah, very good point. This is a crucial issue, particularly for some European member states where land is very scarce. So we know, for instance, already in Netherlands and the same here in Austria, where our institution is based, this is a big contentious issue. But yeah, it's of course, as you can imagine, this kind of information is very challenging to get at the pan-European exercise because much of such information of ownership is often subject to, for instance, privacy rights, and some countries don't even release the ownership of who owns the land and so forth. We are actively working on getting some of this data for specific test studies, and where we can essentially test the influence of that, but it's a bit challenging to implement it at a pan-European scale. That being said, our maps as such, they're also not intended to be, you could say, normative. So that basically saying, okay, here is exactly where you should implement. It's more a sort of best available evidence that we have at a scale that would maximize synergies across multiple objectives and data sets and policy directives across Europe. And from that on, of course, it does not essentially replace detailed national and local planning. And this is essentially also where such factors need to be taken into account. So obviously, things like land ownership at the local scale, this is something that is of great importance, but also very challenging, of course, as you can imagine, to include across all of Europe.
Okay. I continue with a few questions in the remaining time. Something about the costs. Would be interesting to use designation costs to indicate the potential investment needed in each country. So maybe how we use costs, opportunity cost calculation in the project.
Mm-hmm. I can start and then I pass on to Louise. So generally, we have data on opportunity cost that has been produced by a partner in NaturaConnect, which you won't see today. We haven't yet integrated, but this is something that we also see and explore how it will drive the priorities. And on the other side, for investment cost, of course, our maps that basically show essentially the highest potential for essentially the areas with the greatest conservation values across Europe, but are unconstrained by any kind of policy mandates and so forth. These are really the places where, if you want to target investments, would be the best place to do, because these are the areas where you would get, in other layman's term, the most bang for buck, essentially, by conserving or better managing them. So in this sense, our maps can really provide some initial pointers there. Louise, do you, is that a good as explanation?
I think you said everything, but I can just say that, yes, we're going to include these opportunity costs which cover urban, cropland or farmland, agriculture and forestry. And we're going to kind of choose the parameter that both minimizes those costs, but also doesn't compromise too much the biodiversity and habitats that get selected, because obviously we don't want, really poor benefits of biodiversity. So we'll be choosing the parameter that optimizes kind of both at the same time. Yeah.
There's another question on showing the protected areas on the maps. How do you deal with overlapping Natura 2000 sites and nationally designated protected areas? How are they shown on the maps?
I think we addressed this already in writing.
Okay, maybe quickly summarize it.
I just reply that they are dissolved together when our baseline is that all protected areas are counting, and then national designations that are non-overlapping are ignored when our baseline is only natural sites, as per writing in the text.
Great.
Okay.
Then I see one last question here. Great job and presentation. Thanks. Could you elaborate on the reasoning to only assume expansion of existing protected areas? Are you investigating potentially misplaced areas? Perhaps better results on biodiversity conservation and carbon sinks could be achieved with differently located areas entirely.
Yes, that is certainly true. And as Louise showed earlier, we have these unconstrained results that would basically show some of these first the best available guesses, although they're of course building on the existing network. I would like to stress, of course, here that the gazetting or the designation of any existing protected areas is a very challenging process, and is similar on the same way even establishing a new Natura 2000 site is a very challenging and often time-lengthy process that takes often many years, if not decades, to realize. So And given the policy directives that we get from the European Commission and essentially saying how much we extend, our principal ambition is essentially extending and complementing the existing network, while of course also highlighting opportunities within the existing sites.
If I can also just add to that, sorry, you might have mentioned it, Martin, but we're also looking at a variant that only expands on Natura 2000 sites, so that leaves a lot more available area that doesn't basically consider national designations. And yeah, so we're considering Natura 2000 sites anyway to be basically locked in, but we do have a variant where we play with a little bit more available area just outside of Natura 2000 sites. But yeah, great question.
Okay, there is one more question. There are a lot of endemic species and transboundary migration in the Carpathians. Would there be a possibility to extend the project in the future to Ukraine so that the full Carpathian region could be observed?
Yeah, this I know where this question is coming from. We were in very long discussions, of course, how to add Ukraine, so also from the Carpathian Convention side. This is something we are still trying to do as much as possible. Our challenge is that the data that we're integrating in these priority maps, they come from many, many different working groups, projects, models, and data sources. And for instance, if you want to extend the regions to one particular part, that means ultimately that all the input data and all the input data sources need to be available for that region as well. And we are still working hard on hopefully resolving or going into this direction at some point. But it's as you can imagine, very challenging to basically have data availability for all these different areas. But yeah.
Okay, I don't see any more questions. There are a few more comments. Thanks a lot for these. If there's more questions, post them now or later. We can still answer them.
Okay. Yeah, otherwise, I mean, we are relatively good on the time, but also just to say, of course, if you don't have the questions right now, you can also send them to us later on this section so far. This is perfectly fine. And as I can't check it right now, but I believe my colleagues have also responded to some of the comments and questions in chat directly. So you will see also some responses there. Okay, so we're now moving to the next part of this presentation, which is going to get a little bit more interactive, because so far we invited you to provide essentially feedback on the overall maps. So essentially, or the overall methods and basically our aims and goals, what we're trying to achieve with which data. And now we're basically deep diving directly into the map. How we're going to do this is that we have developed a tool, a specifically developed online platform that is specifically designed to gather your feedback. So essentially, you're able to click on the map and add a comment on certain areas. And we can use these comments and this feedback, of course, also to critically interrogate our maps later on, finding, for instance, if multiple people or multiple issues are highlighted, multiple people highlight similar issues, or certain areas are really hotspots of that might be further looks into how we can improve some of our information. And this map itself and the tool is, I stressed it again, is very preliminary. We so far integrating lots of the biodiversity distribution data we received from NaturaConnect project. And of course, there might be some fixes we can do. But of course, the more we get a bit of feedback, the more we also get an understanding and also angle from your experience and your knowledge of certain regions where we might be on a good track and where not. Generally, I also stress that this tool does not collect any spatial data in the form. You will see later that you can enter a username, and I encourage you to enter like a username that is a bit descriptive in the force, but ultimately it's up to you what kind of feedback and comments you leave. So it's not, we don't collect your information for anything else. So in terms of the preliminary maps to show today is that we are showing European-wide priorities at 1 kilometer resolution for protected area expansions. These 1 kilometer resolution in the tool itself, they might a little bit more emphasized than usual. So some grid cells might look a bit bigger potentially, then you might assume them. But you can assume that this is essentially the target resolution that we're using. We're working only on data from biodiversity, so species and habitat distribution, as Louise presented previously in her presentation. And we are showing you essentially an expansion of the conventional 30%, so 30% expansion, as well as management improvement. So management improvement meaning, for instance, existing protected areas that should be increased in management or basically should be enhanced in management type. So for instance, going from a category of 4 or 3 an ICN scale to category of 2, for instance. This specific type and so forth is not something that's shown exactly in the map, but this is essentially one information how you can see a bit more in terms of strictness of protection. Saying all this now, I'm going to demonstrate and showcase you a little bit the tool first. After I finish this demonstration, we will go into small little breakout groups where you can directly utilize the tools for yourself. So the tool itself, wait, I can. So you should all see my screen right now. Once you open the tool, there will be a pop-up tool here. It looks like this with username. You can enter, for instance, in my case, Martin, and then a password, which will be shared later in the breakout groups. The tool itself is essentially an interactive map that's basically similar to Google Maps, where you can zoom in and zoom out. You can zoom in and zoom out, for instance, here with these plus buttons, or in my case, I usually prefer to use my mouse wheel. That's often a bit faster. But yeah, that's essentially one critical way of doing it. In the tool itself, there is some information here in info. You can click on that and basically show some basic information, as well as in the instruction PDF. The instruction PDF is showing when you download it, essentially some general guidance on tool, which you can also utilize for later. Once you've opened the tool, click on pick a layer. Then there is something that's called expansion priorities. Once you enter this, click on this layer, it will take a little tiny while, but after that, it will load the entirety of the distribution layer. That might take a little bit to run. Yeah, there it goes. So, and this is essentially the constrained version that Louise showed earlier in her presentation. With constraint, meaning it expands to 30% protected area across Europe, unless, of course, a member state has already reached the 30%. You can see here the legend that tells you protected area, or PA, with whether a protected area is upgraded, whether it's an expansion priority, or whether it's an existing PA protected area. And you can further zoom in and zoom out from this map. This is essentially this goes. And I'm sorry, there might be a slight delay in the yeah, you can see there's a slight delay in the zooming when I do this. So how do I add feedback? So the whole purpose of the tool is to add directly feedback on the map. There are 3 different options to do so. One is this first one, is the rectangle, which basically adds like essentially a rectangle on the map. This, or like a polygon more. And this one adds a rectangle, and this one adds directly a point. I will demonstrate that now with a point, where I click essentially on a certain place. And once I click on this place, there will be a pop-up that is opening like this. This pop-up shows you a Likert scale that says like, okay, does it look correct? Is this an implementation challenge? Or whether you have a general feedback. So you can move this Likert scale any way you want, basically, on whether you generally disagree with the area or agree and so forth. And then there is this text box here. In the text box, it would be super helpful for us if you can leave essentially some specific feedback of what you like or dislike about this area. It can also be, as shown here, for instance, general feedback. For instance, things you would just like to understand, why is this area selected or not compared to others, right? So basically, because that also helps us, of course, as we get more feedback to really identify, okay, what are certain areas there or not. Once you have entered something, so in this case, I'm just entering this as a test. I mean, yeah, you click here on the save button and then it will close. Similarly, the same process also works within markers with polygons. So for instance, you can hold your mouse and then basically it can able to draw a polygon here. And that will also allow you to enter these kind of feedbacks in it. Finally, before the saving, so you can enter a bunch of feedback on the map itself. One additional information that you could also display is, and you will see that up here in the top, there is a button here is called Add Overlays. When you open this button, it basically shows you like overlay source with a range of selections. It has currently loaded existing European Natura 2000 areas, which to some extent are also already in the gray shaded color because we include them directly in the map. You can add the biogeographical regions, which will be key since essentially the biogeographical regions later also help you a bit to navigate, okay, where are we right now, right? So basically if I zoom in out here, you see, for instance, here the slight transparent background color. In Italy here, here the yellow color is the Mediterranean biome region. Then we have the continental and the Atlantic, the Pannonian, and so forth. So it gives you some indication here. Similarly, you can also upload stream in directly, for instance, the important bird areas. And this is using some of the latest available data. For instance, if you click the button here, it will show you essentially or stream directly in, okay, where are existing important bird area sites and how these might or might not complement some of the priorities that we have identified. In terms of the overlay, there can be sometimes a bit mismatched that when you enter multiple of these overlays that they don't disappear. So the easiest way is always to click this none at the stop here, right? So basically once you click none, it should get rid of all overlays regardless of what else is selected. Finally, and this is the most important step, as you've seen earlier, I've already entered a bit of feedback on the map itself. If I click here on this show feedback, you can see, yeah, here there's something here I've entered or like I added in this slide itself. You can download your own feedback as well. If you click here, download a copy, you're downloading a comma-separated file. A comma-separated file is essentially something you can upload in Excel. However, what we would like you to do after you have entered all your feedback, or you have no more feedback, or you can even enter it later in the coming days, please click this Save button. Once you click the Save button, I'm going to do it right now, there will be like a tiny confirmation here at the bottom. And what that means is that whatever you have entered on the feedback on the map will be saved on our IASA server. Right? And we can later on investigate this feedback and really see, okay, where have you provided this and so forth. And yeah, that is the tool as such. So it's relatively simple. It's of course for us also a bit of a stress test because we have a quite good attendance today with over 70 to 80 people. And I will note that this tool itself will remain accessible later on as well. So in case we're running now into some, I don't know, performance issues or it gets too slow, I will later also the breakout group leads will also let you know about possible alternatives or also opportunities to add this later. So going back, what we're going to do now. We're going to work now in short breakout groups. When we asked you to register for this event, we asked you essentially to select certain areas that you're most familiar with or essentially where you have some experience before. And the main purpose of that was really just to separate you into different groups of geographical knowledge, you could say. Of course, you're welcome to provide comments on other areas as well. As you can see, it shows the entire map. But preferably comment on the areas where you're most familiar with. So what we're going to do now, we're going to open breakout groups. In these breakout groups, there will be a facilitator and so forth. And they will tell you a little bit maybe of some issues or so forth, what alternatives might be adding. And in the breakout groups itself, the whole intention is essentially for you to provide and test out the tool. Is of course, if you have a lot of comments, like, I don't know, many different comments you might want to add or disagreements, agreements, and so forth, don't don't worry, the tool will remain online also after the webinar. So you can also basically provide your feedback at a later stage, right? So basically we're very much open, of course, to receiving further feedback on it. There will be, as I showed before, please log in with a username, can be your own name or your institution. It does not really matter for us. I mean, well, it would be good, but it's really, yeah, those of you who are attending in here. The feedback platform will remain accessible for 2 weeks after this webinar, and the password to log in will be shared in the breakout groups. Okay, with this, I give you now the link, which is prioritycheck.iasa.ac.at. And what we're going to do is we're going to do 15 minutes breakout groups. And again, in the breakout groups itself, we mostly navigate through the tool and zoom in and so out. Please, if you have like questions on why certain areas are selected or not, please enter them as comments, not ask the facilitators necessarily, because also the facilitators might need to investigate this further as well. So we might not have all the answers already doing these breakout groups. Okay, with that being said, I think we can now split up. After this short breakout group, we will reconvene and also can receive some overall feedback or yeah, general comments on what you see, essentially, especially. And yeah, I can see that my colleague has now opened the breakout groups rooms, and you will see at the bottom of your Zoom screen, I believe, there will be also a breakout group button where you can be assigned to the individual breakout groups. This whole session was really just for you just to get a bit familiar with the tool. We did not expect you to provide like extensive feedback now, essentially, or like essentially comment all the comments you might have or not. This is also something you can, of course, also do later. Just in terms of the next steps, and I hope I don't have too much. Yeah, okay. So we want to make like a really short overall, really short, briefly feedback sessions. Basically, maybe you have, from what you've seen, now that you've also personally navigated a bit in the map, maybe, and like looked at a bit out, is there maybe any almost high-level immediate red flags or anything that popped up where it sounds really weird or so, where you think that might be also interested to many other people also when they're providing feedback? And of course, many of you, at least in my breakout group, they also ask, okay, why are certain areas selected, not others? And so this is all relevant knowledge. Please leave them as a comment directly on the platform. We will summarize this. And of course, if there's other knowledge you would like to know about or what is integrated or not, we can try to follow up with you and also with all participants after the webinar. And also highlighting here that we are doing a follow-up webinar at the end of the year where we're integrating a lot more information and also trying to incorporate some of the feedback that you gave us. So this is also, of course, this really useful for us to build on the feedbacking. That being said, are there any immediate burning questions or overall issues?
Andres typed some feedback on the. Do you want me to read the comment?
No, I can see it now. Yeah. So seems an issue with feedback and that. Yeah. I mean, some of them might be comments in not proper order. I think the order ultimately is for us is the main thing that it's recorded, right? So essentially that what you enter is recorded and saved. So once you have entered it, clicking the save button so that we can later on find it and say look at it. So I would not directly concern yourself with that. Of course, you can download the comments yourself and check if they're in order. We will also welcome, of course, if you really want to, you could also send it by email to us, although we would really encourage you to use the save button. Any other highlight points? a lot of villages, urban areas are included. This is a very good question that we are already partly aware of. But generally, one thing to keep in mind is also the maps that are shown on the this priority checker tool. They're a bit essentially also formatted from what our scenarios show to give you like essentially an easy experience of navigating them. As part of that, because everything is essentially a category, like you can say like protected area, expansion, upgrading, and so on. Because it is a category, it means that it sometimes can overrepresent some areas. So meaning, for instance, there might be an area where there's a tiny sliver of upgrading, and there might also be a village nearby, and that might all just be represented at one pixel. So this is, for instance, one potential issue. But if you have it directly there, then please enter it as comment. And afterwards save it.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that in this analysis, I excluded all villages, peri-urban and urban areas from being selected. So basically, whatever is already protected, you can't add any new areas within those categories. So if you're seeing that, it might be because of the maybe slightly coarser resolution that you see on the map online compared with the 1 kilometer maps that I produced. So yeah, just to say that this could just be like a resolution thing.
Can I answer to the point about resolution as well? Thanks a lot, Patrick and John, for your comment there. I want to say that I think at pan-European level, the most useful feedback is to say that somewhere within this area, this region, according to our analysis, we believe it's worth looking into in details and see if indeed these areas are important for conservation. I think it would be too ambitious and probably presumptuous to try to actually do very fine scale analysis for this. So I think our intention is really to identify broadly in this area where national authorities and NGOs should be investigating if these are indeed priorities.
Yeah, high resolution. I mean, it can never be highly resolved enough, depending on what you go. But it's, as you can imagine, we're very much constrained also by the data and so forth. So I managed a bit in the chat. Yeah, good to point out the reason why it's proposed. Exactly. Yeah. So please leave some of the comments in there. I also saw that there's possibly one bug, at least in the show comment fields. And so it might be that it's because at the moment there were like over 50, 60 people opening it at the same time. And there might be some lag or so which recorded. So you can also free, of course, to try it out later. We will send around some instructions later on after the webinar and also give you some further information. So generally, as a closing thing, so how we will use this feedback, right? So basically, why are we doing this whole exercise? So for us is, of course, at the moment, these maps are informed primarily by species and habitats. So basically, there's not something like costs or other constraints and so forth in there, or maybe large undisturbed patches or and so forth. But because we want to really see, okay, what are the areas of conservation importance simply on biodiversity assets alone. And building on that, with your feedback and help, we could try and identify areas of high uncertainty and where such issues are prevailing, and then also adapt our methodological approach if possible based on that. And we will summarize any feedback that you have entered on the platform checker. You could also try and use some other feedback if you have it like in verbal form, so we give you an opportunity to speak out as well. We will summarize that, and following this webinar, we will inform everyone at the end of June 2025 about the steps that we're going to take this. So this platform itself, so the priority checker platform, will remain open until early June. And more information about that you will also receive in an email that will go out to everyone right after the webinar. Okay. And I think, unless there's anything else with that, I can more or less close the meeting. One thing I want to highlight here, we have a survey for this webinar, which you can see here under this QR code. Again, this will also be shared afterwards with you in the email, so don't worry if you can't scan it now. But we will also, of course, very much appreciate your overall feedback and so forth. So anything that you think would be good for us to further provide information on, or other terms of knowledge that would be interesting to you, because ultimately we are very much keen, of course, to make our maps as useful to you as well. Okay, are there any more comments from my colleagues in the chat at this point? I can say there is a question that I received internally, whether the maps are already available. So at the moment, all the data generally of NaturaConnect, both the input species maps, but also the priority expansion maps, will be made openly available as part of the project to everyone. Everyone will be able to download all the data that we produce at the end. However, at the current stage, as you see, we are still in the phase where we're trying to possibly also adapt our methodology and make them as best as possible with the information we have. So therefore, we are not yet making the expansion priority maps openly available, because we want, of course, to make available something that is, of course, is already the best available stage which we can provide. And so, and that, of course, is both possible with your feedback too. Okay, unless there's anything else, I see there's some comments. Okay, perfect. Then we'll close the meeting. We will follow up with everyone in the meeting itself. Please enter this evaluation survey webinar. You will receive later this week also an email from us about further information. And I thank you all very much for participating. I hope it was informative and a bit fun, at least. But it's also the first time that we are doing this in an online setting, so we're of course very interested in hearing from you about it.
Thank you all. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.